Hi, this is Ian for Boris Effects, and today we're going to use Mocha Pro to create this heads-up display VFX composite. Now before we dive into the project, I want to let you know that I've pre-built several different elements just so that we can focus specifically on the tracking aspects of working with Mocha Pro. Now, before I start my track, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I created a null layer here called Blur Levels. To create a null layer, all you do is go up under the Layer menu, choose New, and choose Null Object. Now, I renamed that layer Blur Levels, and I was using it only to add markers into my project here in the timeline. Now, I specifically labeled each of these markers by double-clicking on the marker, and that opened up the Layer Marker menu. Now, if you're wondering how did I create the markers, you can go ahead and press the asterisk key on a full-size keyboard, or you can press Control and 8. You just want to make sure that you have the layer selected where you'd like to apply the marker before you go ahead and hit that asterisk key. All right, so my first marker here says Deep Blur. This is the deepest, blurriest part of our video clip. If I scrub down the timeline here and hold down Shift as I scrub, my current time indicator will snap to the other markers. So here you can see this is where the tips of her eyelashes come into focus. And then right here, the base of the eyelashes are most in focus, but the iris still isn't in focus. So if I scrub down here, you can see now the iris is nice and sharp. I can see that clearly because of the reflection of the lashes here on the front of the eyeball. Now if I scrub down, you can see it racks back to the lashes, and then finally it'll end up back on the tips of those lashes. So with all of these elements marked out, what I'm really going to do is scrub through and decide where I want to start my track. And I want to start it right where the eyelashes are in focus. So I'll go ahead and move my current time indicator to the eyelashes marker here in the middle of the comp at frame 423. Then I'll select my video layer, go up under Effect, go down to Boris Effects Mocha, and apply Mocha Pro. Now you'll see the Effect Controls panel pop up and Mocha Pro is applied, and you'll notice it's below another effect. I have this effect turned off because I'll show you what I did with that a little while later. For now, I'm going to drag the Mocha Pro effect to the top of the effects stack, and then I'll go ahead and click the Mocha button. This will launch the Mocha Pro interface. And since my current time indicator was already on that frame that I specified, I'm ready to start my tracking. Now, inside of Mocha, you might make the mistake of thinking you should track something right along the edge of an area. For example, this pupil. I would draw a spline right around the pupil here, and that's just not the right way to specify the area to track. You should select the pupil and the area around the pupil, making sure to include the edges as a part of the area to track. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and go up to my X-Spline rectangle tool here, and I'll create a large rectangle shape just by clicking and dragging. And this is going to go ahead and specify this entire eye and this whole area here to be tracked. Now, before I start tracking, I want to turn on the grid. So let's go up to the top of the interface and show the planar grid. This will give me a good preview as to how the grid lines up on the eyes. So when I begin the track, we can make sure it's not drifting anywhere in the scene. Now there's one other thing that I want to look at before I start the track, and that's my planar surface. Let's click on the planar surface button, and this is going to show me the surface that the track data is actually going to use when I apply that track to other layers. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but there is a blue cross right here in the middle. And when I hover over it, I get the move tool. So I'll hover over the middle of the planar surface and reposition it right in the middle of the pupil. Now I can turn my planar surface off because I'm not as concerned about that as I am just making sure this track in general doesn't drift anywhere. So I'm going to start tracking from this point, and I'll track all the way to the left. To do that, I first want to specify what motions I'd like to track. And honestly, I don't need to worry about the skew or the rotation. Let's just track the translation and scale. I'll click this left track arrow button to track to the left of the current time indicator. And as it tracks, I'll go ahead and watch the grid and make sure that it's locked onto the eye and stays in the same position during the entire track. Now, if you were wondering why I chose Mocha instead of one of the other trackers inside of After Effects, well, it's simple. It's because Mocha Pro uses a planar tracker, whereas a typical point track actually locks onto an individual point. Since this video clip has such variance in focus and different elements becoming sharp and going blurry, it's actually a lot easier to track using a planar tracker. So that's why I chose Mocha Pro, because it'll be able to actually analyze this clip even as blurry as it gets and give me a really solid track. Now, once you finish tracking in one direction or the other, it's always wise to hover over your playhead and click and drag and just kind of scrub through the clip to see how well the track actually worked. And in this instance, I'm very happy with the quality of this track. I don't feel like there was much drifting at all, if any. Now, I'll go ahead and move my current time indicator right over top of that first frame where we were, which is frame 119. Now I'll go ahead and track to the right by clicking the right track arrow. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hover over my playhead and scrub through here, and I definitely like how this looks. So I no longer need my planar grid, so I'll turn that visibility off. And I like my track. So I'll double click on layer 1 and I'll just name it track. And since I'm done with the tracking, I'll go ahead and turn off the cog so it doesn't reprocess if I accidentally click one of the track buttons. So I'll go ahead and turn that off. And then I'll turn on lock, which means that's going to go ahead and lock all the information off on this layer so that I don't have a chance to accidentally mess something up. Now, I need to determine exactly what parts of the image I would like to matte or mask out. So in this example, I want to actually be able to map graphics into the iris section of the eye, but not the pupil. And I need to create a matte that goes right along this hair here so I can add the hair back over top of the graphics after we insert them into this section of the eye. So let's start by creating a matte for the eye. To do that, I'll go up to my X-spline tools here and I'll grab the elliptical X-spline tool, and I'll start in the upper left and click and drag down to the right, and I'll hold down Shift as I drag, and that'll make sure it creates a perfect circle. And I'll get something relatively close in size and then let go of my mouse and let go of the Shift key. Now, notice I have my splines here, and then I have a bounding box around the outside of those splines. So there are several different ways that I can adjust this. So the first thing I'll do is hover over the middle anchor point on my transform handles, and I'll squash this down, and then I'll click and drag outside all the points and draw a lasso around them so I can reposition all the points right there on the iris like so. Now I'll click outside of all those points just to deselect them, and I'll just move the top one down, and this is looking pretty good, but I think I need to make it all a little larger. So I'll hover over the corner transform handles like so, and just make it a little bit larger in those areas. Now, if you need to see things more closely, you can hold down the Z key for zoom, and then click and drag up to zoom in, or drag down to zoom out. I'm being a little conservative with this matte, so maybe I'll make it come out just a little bit further, and I'll move this 1 point in just like so. Okay, so I'll go ahead and double click on layer 2, and we'll call this iris. Now I want to add to the iris by subtracting out the pupil. So what I'll do is I'll go back up to the ellipse tool here, and I'll click the add ellipse tool, okay? And now I'll click and drag, and I'll hold down Shift as I drag just to select the pupil. And so now I can go ahead and change the size of that like so. And now I think I have a good mask for the pupil. Unfortunately, I didn't make sure that I actually had the iris layer selected when I drew that pupil out, so it made a new layer. If you accidentally make a new layer, you can just click the trash can button to delete it. Here, I'll click on the iris layer one more time. I'll go back up with my plus X-spline elliptical tool. I can go back over here and shift and click and drag. And now that's been added inside the other element. So here, I'll click and drag a lasso around all those points and just make sure to reposition it like so within the pupil itself. Now, I like how this is looking, so I want to go ahead and have this move with the track. To do that, I'll click once on the iris layer, and I'll go down here under Link to Track, and I'll change that to Link to the Track layer. So now, if we scrub through the timeline here, you'll notice the mask is moving along, and it appears to be locked down beautifully over the eye. Now, it's not uncommon for people to want to have minor tweaks as they make adjustments. So here, I'm going to go ahead and move my current time indicator down to where the iris is most in focus. And I can see I'm a little too conservative on this edge. So here, I'll just hover over the upper left corner of the bounding box, and I'll go ahead and make some adjustments to the spline like so. Now you notice I have another keyframe here in the timeline. So I had one all the way at the end, and now I have another one here. And now that's actually looking pretty darn good, and it looks very much like what I want. Although I'm noticing as we're pulling out here, it's getting a little bit large. So what I'll do is go ahead and make everything a little smaller, like so, just at this one point. And I'll actually move it all, whoops, not just the one point. I'll select all the points, and I'll move it all down and to the left just a little bit. So now as I drag here, you can see how things are locked on. That's looking good. Here it's kind of drifted a little far to the left, so here I'll just position it back to the right a little bit. There we go. And I'm just being very nitpicky as I do this. Yeah. And I'll go ahead and go all the way back to frame 1, or frame 0, I should say. And I'll make this even smaller. Okay, so now when I scrub through, you should see, I know the model blinks here in this one area, and I could worry about that mask, but honestly, I'm not going to bring the visibility of these graphic elements in the eye until a little bit later in the scene. So maybe around frame 55 or 56 is where I want to make sure that my mask is actually lining up the way that I want it to over top of that section of the eye. Which right here, I think it's looking pretty good. So I'm going to keep that squared away. Now, since my track layer was red, I'm going to make my iris layer yellow by clicking on the box to the left of the iris, and I'll go ahead and just choose this yellow color and click OK. Now there's one other element I want to add a mask for, and it's this hair right here. So let's scrub our current time indicator until that hair is in focus. So it appears to be in focus right around frame 75. I was way off. Right around frame 80. Perfect. All right. So to add another mask, this time I'll use my X-spline pen tool. So I'll go ahead and just click right there. It's going to create an X-spline layer using a tool that looks like the pen. And I'll start up here just on the top section. I'll click once to add an anchor point. And I'll click again at another curve point. Click again here. Click again there. And I want to make sure that I'm adding these points all the way down across the eye, like so. Now, in Mocha Pro, you don't have to have a closed spline. You can actually have an open spline. And to do that, all you have to do is hold down Shift and then right click. And that'll go ahead and make sure that spline stays open. So now I want to make sure that spline moves with the track, just like I did with the iris layer. And the first thing I'll do is go turn the cog off because I don't need any processing happening. And I'll select layer 4 and go down and say link to track, link to track, track. All right. So now that that's actually linked, I can go ahead and scrub with the current time indicator. And I just want to make sure that that spline stays in the middle of that hair as it's going in and out of focus. And right there, I think it looks pretty good. So I don't need to change that shape very much, if at all. And in fact, I'm just looking at this one section here. Okay, this one point, I'll go ahead and move it just a little bit there. And then I'll come down here. I'll just move that just a little bit there. Perfect. All right, so this is going to give me a mask right over the hair element. So now what I'll do is rename layer 4. We'll call this hair matte. As a matter of fact, we should rename iris to iris matte. And let's change the color for the hair matte to something like green, and I'll click OK. All right, so now when none of the layers are selected, I can see my masks, and I can see the other mask that I created here for the hair, which is great. And now if I scrub through the scene, you should notice that everything is locked down, and we're pretty much ready to go ahead and take this back into After Effects. So since this is functioning as a plugin, we don't really need to do too much to actually bring that info in. All we need to do is go ahead and save this project like so, and then close it. And now I can look at all the different elements that I want to go ahead and place into the composition. So in the top of my timeline here, you'll see this little guy that looks sort of like Ziggy. And this is the Shy Guy button. I want you to click on that, and that'll reveal all the other graphic elements that we've added into our project. Now, all these elements, I'm going to go ahead and double click. So for example, I'll turn on the visibility of my first comp here, and I'll move my current time indicator to about 2 seconds so you can see everything that's going on here. If I double click my circles pre-comp, that'll open the pre-comp here, and you can see all this is a bunch of shape layers that I've gone ahead and animated. Clearly, I've added a repeater to some of the elements, and I animated the rotation and kind of offset those different elements. Now, I'll go back to my eye start here, and I need to position this graphic into the scene. Now, remember how we started the track on the eyelashes marker here? I'm going to do the same thing as I start to place different elements into the scene. So since this is going to be a point of reference, I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift and make sure I'm on the eyelashes marker. So once my current time indicator is positioned over the eyelashes marker, I'll press Shift 1 to add a composition marker. And the value of this composition marker is the fact that when I move my current time indicator around, anytime I press 1 on my keyboard, it'll automatically return to that composition marker right there in the middle of the timeline. So this is where I want to go ahead and line things up. But as you can see, my circles have faded out by this point. So I need to go ahead and move my current time indicator back a little bit and then position the center of these circles right on the pupil of the eye. So I'll select layer 1 and I'll press P to open the position data, and I'll click on that pre-comp and I'll position it like so, right on the center of the eye. Now, I also want to make these circles a little larger, so I'm going to press S for the scale, and you can see they're up at 160% scale, which is exactly what I want. Now, notice as I scrub, the circles aren't moving with the eye. I need to go ahead and apply the track data to this layer. But before I do that, I want to actually apply it to a separate layer. So if I want to make some adjustments to the position of this element over time, I can do so. So let me show you what I mean. Let's go up under the layer menu and go to New Solid. And for this solid, I want it to be 1920 by 1080, and I'll make it bright red, and I'll just click OK. Now I'll go down to my video layer, layer 8, and under Mocha, at the bottom, I have tracking data here. And first thing I want to do is create my track data. And I want to use the track for the track data. So I'll turn off the cog for the hair mat, and I'll turn on the cog for the track, and I'll click OK. Now, if I select layer 8 and press the U key, you can see I've got a lot of different keyframes that have been created for this track. Now, instead of trying to copy and paste these keyframes, I can go ahead and go down here to the export options. So I want to export the transform properties, and I want to export them to the red solid layer I just created. So I'll click Apply Export, and now you can see that red solid layer is positioned in the scene. So let me go back up in my timeline here and select my red solid, and I'll press T to open the opacity, and I'll scrub the opacity down, and you'll notice the center point of that solid is in the middle of the pupil. And the reason for that is when I placed the planar surface in the middle of the pupil, it lined that up. The center of the planar surface is where the center of that track data is. So now as I scrub through, you can see the red rectangle solid that I created is locked in with the eye. So let me go ahead and make sure I've got my circles selected so I can make sure that the circles are centered on the pupil right there on frame 322. So now what I'm going to do is have the circles follow the red solid. So to do that, I'll go to the parent and link column. If this column isn't open, you can right-click next to the layer name and go to Columns and choose Parent and Link. So here, I'm going to go ahead and click on this pick whip for Circles Pre, and I'll point it at the red solid. So now, as I scrub through in the scene, you'll notice those elements are moving along with the eye quite nicely, which is exactly what I want. So I'll turn the visibility of red solid off, and I'll scrub through so you can see now we've successfully created our first graphic reveal, where these graphic elements appear out of the middle of the blurry eye. Now, as the camera keeps moving, these elements are going to have to kind of change blurs, etc. And I'll get to that in a moment. But for right now, let's work on linking up the track data with all the different graphic elements. I'm going to turn off the visibility for my circles pre, and I'll select layer 3 here, my screen 2 pre-comp, and I'll turn its visibility on. Now, to see this, I'm going to press T to open up the opacity, and you can see it's set at 75%. Now I'm going to scrub through here and see if I can see those different elements. And even though I can't, I'll toggle my switches and modes here, and you notice I have different blend modes for each of these layers. Now, this blend mode I chose worked really well based on the effects I've applied to this layer. But for right now, I'll select layer 3 and I'll shift click and make sure all of these different elements are selected or different layers are selected. And I'm just going to change all their blend modes back to normal so we can actually see those graphic elements. So here, with the screen 2 pre-comp selected, now when I scrub through, you can see I've got a whole different series of animations. And what I'm going to do for this one is move my current time indicator to about frame 512. That's where this line is pointed towards the pupil and the iris. And this is going to be the frame that I'll use to link up my tracking. So to do that, all I need to do is grab the pick whip and point it at the red solid like so. And now when I scrub through, you can see these elements are tied to the eye and it's moving accordingly. So that's great. Let's go ahead and turn that visibility off. and I want to select the visibility for layer 4. This is my eye fill. If I double click on that comp, you can see what I've created here. These are rotating different elements that I created inside of, and it's not refreshing now. There we go. These are rotating elements that I created inside of Illustrator, and the visibility of each of the different layers are just turning off and on, which I think is kind of cool. So I'm going to go back to my eye start here, and I need to position this in the scene. So I'm going to press 1 to move my current time indicator back to this comp marker. And then with my eye fills pre-comp selected, I'll reposition this in the scene like so, right over top of the eye. And I need to adjust the scale of this, so I'll select that fill and I'll press S to open up the scale. And I'll scrub on that parameter, and I'll scrub it down to a value right around 50. And this looks pretty good for what I'm looking for. Now, I need to link this up with my track data just like all the other ones. Instead of using the pick whip this time, I'll just click on the drop down and choose the red solid. Now when I scrub through, you can see those different elements are appearing in the different parts of the eye. So that's kind of cool, but as I scrub, I want you to notice some of these elements are appearing outside of the iris. So we'll get there and fix that in just a minute. I'll press 1 on my keyboard to move my playhead back to that marker. I'll turn the visibility of my eye fills off, and I'll turn my eye lines on. Now, to speed things up, I'll repeat the same process that we've done before, scaling, positioning, and linking back to the Mocha track for my subsequent graphic layers. So this is great. All these lines are animating on the eye. I've got the different fills animating on the eye. That looks kind of cool, right? But it's not really refined, and it's not refined because I don't have my mattes applied. So a matte is a black and white representation of transparency, and I can get that based on the Mocha Pro data. So I'll select layer 8, and I'll press Command D to duplicate that layer. And the reason I duplicated this is because I'm going to use this layer as a matte. So I don't need this film effect applied to that layer, so I'll click on the film effect in my effect controls panel and just press delete. And then here under my matte section for Mocha, I want to go ahead and view the matte. And it's going to take a second to turn on, but it's saying all visible layers. Well, let's see what visible layers are. I'll click on the visible layers button, and sure enough, the track matte is on. I don't need that. And the hair matte is on. I don't need that. I just need the iris matte. So I'll go ahead and turn those on. And now you can see I've got the iris here. And like I said, a matte is a black and white representation of transparency. So whatever's white is going to allow the graphic through, and whatever's black is going to get knocked out. So I'll position this element right above my eye lines little comp here. And I'll go to my track matte area. If you're not seeing track mattes, what you need to do is toggle your switches and modes button right here so you can see the different modes. So I want my eye lines layer, layer 7, to look at the layer above and use the luminance for that matte to determine its transparency. Now to speed things up, I'll duplicate this process again and mask out the other elements for the eye. So now everything is actually masked out. If I go ahead and scrub through here, you can see those graphic elements appear inside the eye, but they're not appearing anywhere outside of the iris. Now, if I want to soften up the edges of the matte, I can do so inside of the Mocha Pro effect. So here, I'm going to go ahead and select my eye fills comp right here, and I'll toggle the visibility off and on. And you can see here on the edge, it's kind of sharp. So what I'll do is I'll go here and select layer 4, and I'll go to the matte section, and I'll just increase the feather value like so. And that's going to soften the edge of that matte. So I don't want it to be super soft, I just want it to be a little soft. So here I'll set it to a value around 15, and that's just going to soften up that edge just a little bit. And to speed things up again, I'll feather the mask for the other mask layers. And now we get a little bit of a softer transition between the different elements. Now that we've tied all of the tracking data to the different elements in the scene, what we can work on doing now is actually stylizing the elements and then stylizing the footage, etc., etc. So actually we should start by stylizing the footage. I'm going to go down to my bottom layer here, which is layer 11, and I'll just collapse the layer so you can see that it's selected. And for this layer, I'll turn on the S film effect, which is the Sapphire film effect. So I'll turn the visibility on and boom, you can see I've already got this really cool effect. Let me open up the Sapphire film effects options here. And I want to show you the fact that you can actually load presets. If I go ahead and click the load preset button, it's going to take a second to open the preset browser. But in here, I've got a whole host of different presets I can use as starting points. All I need to do is just click on one of the presets and choose load, and it'll be applied. Now I'm going to click cancel because I like the style that I went ahead and created here. Now, just as an aside, if you ever want to know what parameters have been changed within an effect or something on a layer that you've changed, all you need to do is select that layer and press the U key twice rapidly, UU. And that will show you any of the parameters that you've changed from their default settings. So you notice here here, let me make my timeline a little larger. So you notice here within the film effect, the Sapphire film effect, I adjusted the red, green, and blue settings for the print light settings. I offset the darks. I changed the glow width. I changed the grain amplitude. I didn't want to add any grain, so I set that to 0. I added a little bit of a vignette and a little bit of a blur mask, so it's a little blurry around the edges. So this effect is really kind of deep. The other nice thing about it is the fact that you can actually choose the negative film and the print film. So you can really stylize the look. But the reason I went ahead and applied this style was so now when I go ahead and start applying the style to the different line elements, I can see how everything blends together. Now I'll select my eye fills layer, go up to my effect controls, and I'll turn on my Boris Continuum effect of LED. And you notice that's created kind of an interesting look here. I'll zoom into the comp by pressing the period key to zoom in, and you can see it's giving these nice little LED looking textures into those elements. I also added another continuum fast lens blur to just soften up that look a little bit. Let's look at the lines. I'll select layer 7. Here, I started with a tint where I mapped white to a slight green color. And that gave a green color to those lines. And then I added my continuum glow alpha edges, which really helped that pop. And then I added the lens blur on top of that, just to soften that a little bit. So I did the same thing down here with this one, tint, alpha edges, and fast blur. So here now you can really see what this actually looks like in the scene. Let's go back here to my Screen 2 pre-comp and turn its visibility on. And you'll notice if I zoom out, I can resize this panel to fit to the composition by pressing Shift/. All right, to stylize these, I used several different effects. You can see I used the Sapphire Rack Defocus, which kind of give it a neat little soft look. I added the Boris Continuum Prism effect, which gave a neat little separation between the red, green, and blue. And then I added a sapphire glow on top of that. Now, in addition to these options, I went ahead and changed the blend modes for those layers. Now we'll go back to my Screen 2 pre-comp and click on the drop-down. And for this, I actually liked Classic Color Dodge, which really heightened the interaction between the blurred effects and the background video. Let's select my eye fills here. And for the fills, I set that blend mode to Vivid Light, which just made things melt into the eye a little more clearly. Now, let me go back here to my eye lines at the bottom. This eye lines I set to screen. And that's going to just create a slightly additive effect. And here I'll click on my eye lines, and my last eye lines I set to classic color dodge. And so now those elements are really blended into the scene. But there is one problem. You'll notice that hair isn't over top of the graphic. Unfortunately, the graphic is over top of the hair. So what I'm going to do is go down to my video layer here, and I'll press Command D to duplicate that layer. Okay, and with that layer duplicated, I'll go ahead and position that to the top of the layer stack above all the other graphic elements like so. Now I only want just that one mask applied. So what I'm going to do is go up here under my Mocha Pro, and I'll go to the mats. And unfortunately, I can't really get a matte off of a single spline. But what I can do is create an AE mask based on that spline. So what I'm going to do is go up here, and I'll go to visible layers. And I want just the hair mat visible. So I'll turn off the other two layers, and I'll turn that off. And then down here, I'll make sure my shape is going to be all visible. And then here, I'll say create AE masks. And when I do that, I can now select layer 3 and press M, and you can see my hair mask is actually in the scene. So in order to have an effect stroke that specific area, I'm going to go up under the effect menu, and I'll go to generate, and I'll choose stroke. So the stroke is going to look at the hair mat, which is the mask that's been applied. Now I need to increase the size of the brush to match the distortion on the hair. So here I'll go ahead and increase the size of the brush like so. And that looks pretty good. I can bring the hardness of the brush down because it is supposed to be soft. So you know what? It should be really low, like 35 or less. Here, let's do 17. Okay, so that's really soft. And I'll make the brush size even larger. And what I need to do is actually keyframe this as the hair blurs. So I'll go ahead and add a keyframe here for brush size. And I'll just move down the timeline just a little bit like so. And with all these effects and everything, it's going to take a second to refresh what's going on in the scene. So to speed things up, what I'll do is solo this one layer, and I'll, just solo that one layer. That's perfect. So here, if we scrub, let's scrub through the scene. Okay, right there, it's a little more narrow, so I'll go ahead and make that brush size smaller. There we go. Cool. And with this layer selected, I'm going to press the U key, not once, but twice. And that will show me that I've got my Mocha Pro, which I don't necessarily need to see, so I'll collapse that. Here's my stroke width. So you can see I've got 2 keyframes for this now. This is when it pays to actually look at the layer that I created earlier, my blur levels layer. So I'll go ahead and move my blur levels layer up just above my hair mat. So what I'll do is add keyframes that will match these markers. So here, I'll hold down Shift as I scrub, and there I'm on the tips section. So I'll change the brush size of that to be a little more narrow. There we go. Okay, it could be a little larger here for this one section. There we go. The iris. You know what? I'll just move this keyframe right here over the iris, and I'll make that just a little wider. There we go. lashes. Since we had this blur level before, I'll just copy and paste. There we go. And then let's go back here all the way to the beginning to the deep blur. And that's when this should be super fat. So I'll go ahead and just make that nice and fat like so. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and look at the stroke effect. I want the stroke effect to not be on the original image, but to reveal the original image. So it's really only creating just this section here. So when I turn the visibility of this solo off, so we can actually see how this looks in the composite, you can see it's blended over top of the other layer and it should be seamless. If I go ahead and move this down to the tips section here, you'll notice once everything refreshes that now the hair is nice and sharp right over top of our graphic, and it's actually over top of the graphic. So thanks to the fact that I could use Mocha Pro's ability to actually create an open path, I could use that to create an AE mask, which I then added the stroke to and was able to add this over top. So I'll select layer 4 and I'll press return and I'll just call this hair over. So the only thing we have left to do is just enable our circles pre-comp right here. And within the circles pre-comp, if I press the U key, you'll notice I have the rack defocus effect that's applied, and I'll just turn that on. And what that's going to do is actually create the defocus of those circles. So in this area, they're going to start nice and sharp. You'll notice the defocus width is set to 0 here, but it's keyframed. So as we move further down the timeline, it's going to get wider and wider with the defocus width. So eventually they just kind of blur out of the scene because it gets really, really wide. Here you can still see them. It's just a little bit of an adjustment here. There we go. So see, you can see at 28, they're still there and they're blurry and they just blur right out. So it looks like the camera's kind of moving through those effects. And then right here, I have it actually fade out and disappear towards the end of that section. So now that we're finished, I'll queue up the finish animation so we can check out exactly what it is we built. All of this project's tracking and masking is made possible with Mocha Pro and assisted with some of the great filters from Boris FX, Sapphire, and Continuum plugin packages. Thanks for watching, and make sure to follow Boris FX on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram to stay up to date with the latest information and training materials for Mocha Pro, Continuum, Sapphire FX, and all the Boris FX products.